Industrial piercings. Pros, cons, advantages, disadvantages. Going to give you 5 of each. Also, along with what you should know before getting the piercing experience, what it should be like, healing, what that is, basically what that involves, jewelry options, living with the piercing, and what happens if you go, hey, I don't want this thing anymore. I'm going to take it out. Coming up next on Pros and Cons by a Piercer, Season 2, Episode number 10. So you out there should probably stick around. For those that are new to the channel, my name is DaVo. I'm a professional body piercer and have been since 1994. I own and operate the Axiom Body Piercing Studio located here in Des Moines, Iowa, inside Skin Kitchen Tattoo. So, when I talk to you about these things, I'm talking about a level of expertise that comes from being in the body piercing industry for well over 26 years. So what are we going to talk about today is the industrial piercing. Or at least I'm going to talk about it. This is kind of always a one-way conversation. I don't know why I say we're going to talk about it when it's just going to be me. Industrial piercings are any piercing done on the body, for those who don't know, that involves a straight or standard barbell, bent or in its original form, that connects 2 piercings. Traditionally and usually done on the ear. However, it has been tried in a lot of different other parts of the anatomy. And I will leave that to your own imagination. Most of them were not particularly successful. Sometimes they were, but most of them weren't. Traditionally, when we're talking about industrial piercings, most people automatically think of what we used to refer to as scaffolding. And that's the forward helix to outer helix industrial with 1 bar. However, there are other combinations that can be done, like conch to conch, or even really exotic ones like trachis to conch, or antitrachis to rook. I've seen them all. Some of them look good. Some of them don't look good. It really comes down to your anatomy and the ability of the person piercing you, and basically your combined imagination. This piercing dates back to the early 1990s, about 1992 or so or before. It was developed, or at least the person that gets credit for it, is Erik Dakota, and then it was featured in the Body Play magazine, which was Fakur's publication, which I used to buy on a regular basis. I think, if I remember correctly, it was a feature of Erik, and it also had photos of the Daith piercing and the Rook piercing. For many of us, that was the first time we saw these piercings, and we have a lot to thank Erik for either developing these piercings or at least making them popular. Now, let's get into the pros, the advantages, the reason you come here of this particular piercing. Number 1. This can be done in a lot of different combinations. As I stated before, you can do the traditional helix to helix, which is probably the most common and easy to do. Most people, I'd say, flipping the coin, about 50% of the general public have the anatomy to do that particular piercing. Or you can do other combinations. What it comes down to is whether or not the 2 piercings are going to fit in a straight line, or the jewelry can be bent and manipulated in a way where it doesn't allow pressure on that particular piercing. The problem with it is that we do not want to create situations where, let's say this is what we're piercing, is this my left hand, where the angles are vastly deep like so. And the reason being is this, in some cases, your body will consider kind of like abuse. It creates hot spots, so it can make bumps, increase the likelihood of rejection or migration, and a whole host of other problems. Number 2, this one fits well into the anatomy. It just kind of climbs out or cries out for it. Often we do this if we're doing the scaffolding style, the old style helix to helix. We'll generally try to do it so it matches the ridge that we pierce and call a rook. It really kind of like fits and accents that. Also, you can do multiple groupings, which I will talk about maybe a little bit later, where you can do crosses or multiple scaffolding, so it looks like your ear is ready to have work done on it. Number 3, this is an established piercing. This is not a new thing. This is not extremely experimental. However, if you start getting into the more exotic ones, the more not so common versions of this particular piercing, it can turn into more of an extreme piercing with a higher risk of rejection. But these have been around since the 90s, close to 30 years. Lots of people have healed these out with, issues or maybe not issues. Depends on how lucky they are and how tolerant their body is. Number 4, I kind of talked about this a little bit just now or before. These can be done in groupings. They can be done, it's a stack with the helix piercings if you have the anatomy for it. They can also be done as crosses. You can do multiple ones, like maybe a conch and helix to helix, or conch, helix to helix, and make kind of a cross or a giant T kind of intersection. It really comes down to your anatomy, the space that's there, and what is possible. Number 5, this not really a common piercing. We do quite a few of them, but it's my experience that since it does have a lot of risk of rejection, it is a difficult piercing to heal. It is a difficult piercing to do in some cases, that a lot of people just abandon this piercing during the healing process. It's not something you commonly see. Maybe a little bit more so than maybe some of the more extreme piercings, but it's a fairly uncommon thing. It's not something you're going to see 5 soccer moms have at the next soccer game you go to. Or for everyone else in the world, footy game. Now with the pros out of the way, let's move on to the cons. And before we do that real quick, I just want to mention, if you like the video, find it educational, edifying, entertaining, hit that thumbs up. Let me know that you liked it. I like it when you like it. If you haven't already, please subscribe, hit that notification bell so that you're notified every single time we post something. So now let's move on to the cons, the disadvantages, the things we absolutely do not like or for the most part tolerate when it comes to this particular piercing. Number 1, it is a piercing that is hard to isolate. And the other issue, and one of the reasons why you want to do that, is usually it's done in areas of the body where your anatomy is not fixed. It's flexible, meaning that any trauma, pressure, any kind of movement is going to put strain on that piercing or shift the jewelry or what have you. They have to be isolated. Usually most people want to get that helix to helix. It's on the upper ear. That comes in contact with hats, helmets, goggles, masks. We're still doing this pandemic thing, you know. And we all do the pandemic dance. You know what I'm talking about? You get 2 steps towards the door, and you're about ready to go in, and then you do and then you turn around and go back to your car and get the mask. The pandemic dance. Anyway, so you have a lot of things that come in contact with this particular part of your anatomy. Obviously, you cannot sleep on it. Sleeping on it will cause issues and problems. So it's one of the reasons why this makes this a pretty difficult piercing to heal. It can be difficult to heal, as I just mentioned. This piercing, you are taking 2 piercings and forcing them to stay in position. Sometimes the body wants absolutely nothing to do with this. The angles can be a little less than 100% 90 degree. It can be a real pain. It's really acceptable to any type of trauma, even the slightest bump or the slightest catch on something, and suddenly a healing piercing is a giant bumpy nightmare. This piercing, it can take a long time to heal, and in some cases will never really get to that point where you can do just about whatever you want to them. Number 3. Anatomy. Not everybody has the anatomy for this particular piercing. Even if it's just the more traditional helix to helix, unless you have those pronounced ridges, the piercing can't be done. You don't have the tissue to support the piercing. The other thing is that if there is anything in the way, like with my upper ear, I have a kind of a dome-shaped one, and the helixes kind of peel back a little bit. With me, I'm not a good candidate. I cannot get this done because there would be so much pressure on the center pulling outward against the piercing. And in most cases, it'll start digging, if you do it, it'll start digging a groove into that dome area at the flat part of the ear, upper ear. So anatomy is extremely important with this particular piercing. You either have it or you don't. If your piercer, he looks at it or she looks at it or they look at it and they go, hey, no, I don't want to do this. You don't really have the right anatomy. Don't get mad. Don't go to somewhere else that'll be willing to do it. Be happy that they were honest with you and saved you money and also a lot of frustration over trying to get a piercing to heal that isn't going to. Periods of grumpiness. That would be number 4. This piercing, even after it heals, if it gets bumped just right, it's really acceptable to trauma. It can be kind of a nightmare. It doesn't like to get caught. They don't like to get touched. They don't like to get pulled on. They don't like pressure on them. They don't like being slept on. And this is years and years after the piercing is initially done and even healed. So it's one of those piercings that you have to continue to isolate. You still have to maintain. It's not kind of a, run and wear kind of situation. You really have to be committed to this particular piercing and be willing to deal with periods of grumpiness even years down the road. Number 5, this is an advanced piercing, meaning that it is an advanced heal. It takes a little bit more work than other piercings. The other thing is the piercer themselves has to have the proper skill set. It is not one of those piercings that just about anybody can do, or even somebody with a little bit of experience might be able to figure out. This is a very difficult piercing to do a lot of times. It has to be perfectly straight. It has to be right on with the angle, not only this way and that way, but that way and that way. You can't be off a little bit. If it involves, because your anatomy involves bending or adjusting the jewelry in a way that it's going to fit into your anatomy, you have to have that skill set to do that. It's not something that everybody has. It's something that only a certain number of piercers really will play with. So always consider that beforehand, and that's why I consider it a con. Before I get too far into things you should look for, I want to talk to you about our merch store. We have very similar designs, very similar colors, very similar products, from clothing, t-shirts, leggings, etc., and hoodies, because it's cold outside, at least in this part of the world, to throw pillows and beach towels and all kinds of stuff. About over a dozen different designs, too. Check it out. The link is in the description. There's also one of those merch bars. So let's talk a little bit about what you should look for before getting the piercing done and consider beforehand. First thing, your piercer should be experienced, especially with this particular piercing. They should be professional. They should be willing to answer questions. They should be open with education. They should be passionate about their job and their art and be willing to talk to you about these things. I get a lot of responses and comments on here about, I wish my piercer was this or that. One of the things you always want to look for is, do they like talking about piercing in the first place? Are they sick of it? Do they not really give up much information? Do you feel like you're keeping them from doing what they want to do right now? These are all things you want to consider when you're first meeting a piercer or even somebody you've done business with for a long period of time. Burnout is a thing, especially in this business. They should offer a consultation beforehand that'll include the risks, what it's going to take to heal it, and check your anatomy to make sure that it is workable with the particular piercing that you want. Now, there's an open train of thought on this, and there are situations where one might be better than the other one. But for a majority of situations, especially with helix to helix and conch to conch, a standard straight barbell is your best option. Not getting pierced with multiple pieces of jewelry and then trying to get that stuff to fit in there after the piercings have healed. There are some cases where maybe that is a better option, or maybe you're coming off a older piercing and connecting with something else, where they can be done separately and possibly should be done separately. This is something you should talk to your piercer about before you start this project. Because it's my experience, when you pierce two and put two separate pieces of jewelry in, they tend to kind of migrate or move one way or another. Then you go to try to connect the two piercings and you have issues. Yeah, or you have to pretty much customize the jewelry to fit a person's anatomy. If you leave it in there, and even in that case, I've had issues where suddenly your body's like, no, I'm not tolerating this at all, and will start flaring up, even though those two piercings are well healed and well seasoned. So one barbell is usually your best option, or discuss it with your piercer. The next thing is about technique. You need to ask them if they do the one needle method or the two needle method. Most cases, two needles are needed to do this piercing, and it's usually best. The reason being is that any hypodermic needle, once it's used, it dulls. So when you're doing one piercing with the needle and then pushing it through another part of the body without the same needle, the second piercing will always be more painful and cause more additional trauma and tearing and etc. instead of cutting. The problem with the two piercing thing is the two needles is they really need to be skilled at what they're doing, because it's very easy to mess up the angles on this particular piercing. So you want to talk to them about that. What is their thinking on it? What is the method that they generally use or feel comfortable with? Personally, it really depends on the person's anatomy, but in most cases, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pierce one side, then I'm going to pierce the other side with two separate needles and then connect the jewelry. It's a pain in the ass. It's complicated. Insertion of the jewelry and getting the balls on it, everything else is a bit longer, but in the long run, it tends to create a cleaner piercing with less trauma. The next thing you need to talk to your piercer about, or at least ask, is do they supply Aftercare products in information? Do they sit down with you and talk you through how to heal the piercing, or do they have a video or something available that you can watch and get a clear understanding on how to take care of it? Do they offer written instructions? They should include also the size of the jewelry, the type, what the material is, and when it was done and who did it, just for your knowledge and future reference. The next thing you want to talk to them about is Aftercare product. Do they supply it? What do they suggest? Do they sell it? What's the cost? It's a good idea to have all those ducks in alignment so that once you get the piercing done, you can just simply go home or go on with your life without having to wander around whatever area of the country you live in trying to collect stuff like a scavenger hunt to take care of your piercing. Now, the last thing to consider or think about before getting a piercing done, or this particular piercing done, is, especially if you're doing helix to helix, is where your hair is and how it's going to affect the piercer's ability to do their job. If you have a lot of tiny little baby hairs around the area and they constantly get hot on that area, it's a good idea to either trim or shave those. Make our lives easier. If you have long hair that's kind of on the stringy side and it's going to get in the way, put it up before you come in. Get it as tight as you possibly can. It's going to make our lives a lot easier and make us happy. And piercers like being happy most of the time. With that out of the way, let's talk about the piercing experience itself. During the marking period of it, usually we disinfect, then we mark. If you have any future ear piercings that you're planning on getting or thinking about getting, talk to your piercer about it at that time, especially if they're going to be in that general area. This piercing takes up a lot of room. There isn't always any room left over afterwards to put additional piercings in. This can affect, if you say, hey, I plan on doing this or that, can affect the angle, the placement, maybe the jewelry they use to give you that extra space to get that future piercing that you love and want. This piercing is usually done, like I said, either with one needle or two, preferably two needles, and a cork or a needle receiving tube. This is done freehand, usually not done with forceps. However, in some cases, especially with the helix to helix, or maybe something that involves a trachea or an anatrachea or what have you, if the tissue is rolling, meaning that when you pinch down on it, it kind of rolls to one side or another, it might be a good idea if there's room to use a set of forceps to flatten out that tissue and keep it in place. Now, that's not always the case, but there are a few times when I've said, okay, screw this, I'm going to put the forceps on and clamp this. Usually it's done, the way we do it is either a two-needle method, which is preferable, Me personally, if I'm doing helix to helix, I'll do the outside first, the back out here. Push the jewelry in using a needle. Usually I have like a threaded taper or threaded insertion pin just to make life easier and not have to worry about it. And then I'll push that through, put the end on. Then I will line the needle up, making sure that the angle's right to do the forward area of the helix, or if we're doing conch to conch, basically the same thing, and then close it. So that can take a little while to get that jewelry in, but the piercing is kind of a two-push, and there might be a bit of a break between the two as it takes a little while sometimes to get that jewelry in and get that ball on and get things to where we want them to be. Now, after the fact, immediately after, there might be some slight bleeding off and on. That'll last usually maybe about a couple minutes. Usually not profuse or heavy. When it does look like there's a lot of it, it's usually because it kind of traps underneath that bar on your upper ear. And there's just no way to get in there and clean that in some cases. I mean, we always leave a gap, but sometimes that gap's not really that big. And there's very few things you could fit underneath there that's not going to hurt. So don't be alarmed if you see a little bit of bleeding immediately afterwards. Now, you're going to usually have a little bit of throbbing, aching, warmth that you're going to have with any upper ear cartilage piercing of any type. That will usually last a few minutes. It's going to be, of course, extremely tender to the touch, even for throughout the healing period, but immediately afterwards especially. Now let's talk about the fun part, healing. This one takes a while to heal in most cases, anywhere from 12 to 16 weeks, maybe longer. I've had clients that it's taken close to a year and a half to really get to the point where I would say it's healed. They tend to be an open wound primarily for those first couple of weeks or first 12 weeks or so. They take a long time to season. It's not really that long of a piercing. It's not a very wide piercing we're doing, usually like with conches or helix to helix or some of these other piercings. But it's the combination of the two piercings being held in place. It's more acceptable to trauma, so thus it takes longer to heal, and it's more sensitive to trauma and pressure and etc. I'm going to suggest that you clean it twice a day using sterile saline solution, also practicing cross-contamination prevention, which means clean your hands before you handle it. No oral contact or exchanging bodily fluids on you around the piercing until it heals. Keeping your bedding, clothing, towels, anything that comes in contact with it, cleaning it on a regular basis. Keep pets away from it, especially small animals that like to sleep up by your face. Do not swim. I don't care what it feels like. Don't swim. I can't put it any clearer than that. Until it is completely healed. Now, after it's healed, you can swim all you want to, especially if you feel like you're getting a good amount of exercise and it's reducing the stress in your life. Okay, and also make sure that your hair is clean or dry before it comes in contact with the piercing. Wet hair can cause issues with any healing piercing. It can contaminate the wound, cause an infection, all kinds of other problems. So always make sure your hair is completely dry before it comes in contact with the piercing. The other thing is avoid contact with unclean objects. Now, this is a lot of things with this piercing. Anything that comes in contact with your ears. Just think of it that way. Hats, clothing, bedding, glasses, sunglasses, headphones, earbuds, telephones, anything that comes in contact with that general area needs to either be marked off the list of things that you do, or it needs to be cleaned on a regular basis to make sure that you don't get an infection or other problem. The other situation with contact is it can be abusive and cause trauma. So avoiding contact in general is your best option. For example, answer the phone with the other side if you have this side pierced. And that's why I generally suggest if you have a healing piercing on an ear, you do one side, heal it out, then do the other side. So you always have one to use. I'm probably going to say this 35 times, but avoid contact with the area. Do not sleep on it. Sleep on your other side of your back, or figure out a way to elevate it off the bed. Also, do not wear helmets or anything that's constrictive that's going to cause issues. With the masks, as we're involved in a pandemic, you want to be careful with anything that's putting a lot of pressure, because sometimes those bands are a little too tight, or people tie them so they're tighter because they feel like they're falling off. So consider getting the clips to go in the back, or getting the ones that wrap around your head instead of the ones that go over your ears. When you're removing them, make sure to be very careful you're not catching the jewelry as you remove those strings from behind your ear. Same thing with glasses, sunglasses, and etc. You really, really have to isolate this area and treat it like the forbidden zone, and handle it with kid gloves. Kid gloves. Is it kid gloves or kid gloves? I think it's kid gloves. So that you make sure that it doesn't get any trauma or has an excuse to suddenly flare up and be a pain in the ass. Back to hair. Consider trimming the area, cutting it, shaving it, whatever, to keep it away from the piercing itself. Sometimes loose hairs can start stringing around the jewelry. It pulls on it when you move your head or what have you, or comb or brush. It's best if it just plain doesn't have any contact whatsoever. After the first 3 to 5 days, you're going to experience redness, discolorization, heat, tenderness to touch, and maybe a little bit of slight bleeding off and on. That usually is a reaction to the trauma of the actual piercing. Sometimes with this particular style of piercing, you're going to see that a little bit longer because we're keeping it in that ridge state. It's not uncommon to see a lot of swelling with this particular piercing, or have discomfort maybe as far in as a week and a half or 2 weeks. Do not sleep on the piercing. I already said this, but like I said, I'm going to say this 35 times. I don't care how much it doesn't hurt. I don't care if it feels pleasurable. I don't care if that's the only side you can sleep on. You cannot sleep on the piercing while it's healing. You need to figure out a way to elevate it off the bed. It might feel great as you lay there and you go to sleep, but then you wake up the next morning and there's this giant bump on it, and it throbs and aches and everything else, and you're contacting your piercer going, I don't know what happened. It suddenly is all flared up, and I got this giant bump. I don't know what happened. When you know, it's because you slept on it. So don't sleep on it. With healing out of the way, let's move on to jewelry options or jewelry. The first thing is, if the jewelry is loose, because usually we pierce a little bit on the big side, going to a shorter or tighter piece of jewelry once it heals can be to your advantage, because it eliminates the amount of movement, and it also gives it a slightly lower profile, so it's less likely to get caught on things. So always readjust the jewelry if need be after the piercing is healed. See your piercer for the proper sizing. The jewelry needs to be long enough that it's not causing the piercing to cause the area to fold. Basically, think about it. If you take your index, put it against where your forward helix is, the front of your ear, and then put the other one on the other end and pinch down, imagine what that piercing is going to do if it healed out perfectly and you suddenly put something really small in there and there's that much pressure on it. It's going to suddenly flare up and have issues. So the jewelry needs to be long enough to comfortably fit. Probably the most common mistake that people make when it comes to jewelry with industrial piercings is they get really complex or ends that have sharp edges, points, and etc. that get caught on absolutely everything. It's usually best to stick with simplistic jewelry that has no sharp edges, no things hanging off of it or anything else that can get caught on bedding, washcloths, hats, your hair, and everything else. Simple is best. The jewelry should always be internally threaded. Threaded or externally threaded jewelry can cause damage to healed piercings. And what that is instead of the ball threading onto the post like a screw, or like a nut, I should say, it has the ball or end has a piece of threading that comes off of it that threads into the inside of the post. So when you're putting that post through, there's no threading or anything there to get caught on the piercing or cause damage. The other option would be threadless, if you can find them in these larger gauges, because they're usually, the industrials are usually done in a larger gauge, like 14 gauge or larger, just to give it an additional support and make sure that if it does have some impact or trauma, it's not going to damage the piercings immediately. Thicker can handle a little bit more abuse is what I'm getting at. Now, if your piercer customized the jewelry, like bent it to fit your ear, you will need to go back to that piercer and have them adjust any future jewelry in the future. Don't try to do it yourself. You probably don't have the tools to properly do it. You can totally wreck a perfectly fine piece of jewelry that you love and you spend a lot of money on. Just spend the money if you have to, if they charge for this sort of thing, but let them do it. If they damage it, they're going to have to replace it. And also ask them about that too. Now let's talk about living with the piercing. The jewelry should be left in at all times. Any piercing, especially with ear piercings where they tend to close pretty rapidly, you really want to leave the jewelry in. Taking the jewelry in and out all the time or leaving it out for long periods of time always risks not being able to get that jewelry back in, or the jewelry closing, or some other issue. It's best just to leave it in. Like I said, I'm going to probably say this 35 times. Avoid pressure and trauma to the piercing area. Even after the piercing is healed, you may find sleeping on that side completely uncomfortable, or you may notice the next morning when you wake up, it's sore and tender. And this may continue until you either abandon the piercing or you're no longer with us. But please don't go quickly. Or quietly into that good night. When buying glasses, sunglasses, and etc., test them. You really kind of need to know where that mark is at or where that top ball is at, and whether or not it's going to come in contact with it. Now, this comes down to even the conch to conch or the helix to helix. Putting pressure on that piercing even after it heals with glasses can be a problem. Also, during the healing process, it can contaminate the area. That's one thing I should have probably mentioned during the marking is if you do wear glasses on a regular basis, you do want to bring them to your piercing appointment. You probably won't wear them while you're getting pierced, or maybe even when you're getting disinfected and marked, but it's a good idea to check it to make sure they're not going to have a lot of contact with this particular piercing, especially the helix to helix or conches that are more done towards the top, conch to conch. Now the last thing, what happens if you decide you don't want the piercing anymore? If you remove the jewelry, it'll probably close fairly rapidly, usually anywhere from a week to 10 days for most people. It really depends on how long you've had the piercing. You'll be stuck with 2 indentation scars on each side, about the thickness of the jewelry itself. The additional thing with these is sometimes it'll cause a looping effect where the tissue that used to be like this suddenly grows out a little bit, like it made room for the piercing. Usually it's more noticeable on helix to helix, and it's usually the outer part or the back part that you're going to notice that. That is probably not going to go away. It's just kind of your body's been adapted and changed in a way that it's probably not going to return back to its normal state. Now, is it going to be overly noticeable? Usually not. Everybody's different, though, but you should understand that this piercing can produce that type of scarring or change the look of your ear. Now, the holes might produce this cream cheesy, smelly, gross stuff that collects inside the piercing, and then when you squeeze it, it squirts out, and it's gross and smells awful. That's sebum. It is a natural oil that your body produces, probably combined with a little bit of dried or dead skin cells. It's not something you need to be concerned about. It is not a sign of infection. Of course, whenever in doubt or you think something's infected or what have you, see your physician. Have them take a look at it, or maybe you're in there for an appointment for something else and go, hey, can you look at this? It's always a good idea. If I brought up a question or I missed something, or you'd like to share your experience of having an industrial piercing, please leave a comment. I usually answer them when I have time. Otherwise, till next time, here's hoping all your piercings heal with ease and without a single issue. And if you're in the Des Moines, Iowa area, I hope to see you for your body piercing needs in the future. Have a good day, everybody. Take care of one another. Take care of yourself. Go out, try to have some fun, and we'll see you in the next video.